Hey there, welcome back. Glad to see you again. This is the last lecture, and this lecture corresponds with Chapter 4 in our text, so regulations and good clinical practices. The first two lectures of this module were strictly about the Code of Federal Regulations, the FDA regulations that apply to clinical research coordinators and sponsors, and so now we're going to talk a little bit about other regulations and good clinical practices. So first thing we need to talk about is HIPAA. And you might have heard of HIPAA before. It's the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. It's been around for 20 years now. It was a big change at the time for how we used health information. So it was a big shift, but it's now sort of become very understood and common. And it's designed to protect the rights of patients to control their private and confidential medical information. And that was really the impetus for it. It's had other impacts beyond that, but that was really the basis for the law. It applies to all clinical research that uses identifiable personal health information, and all clinical research does involve identifiable personal health information, so you do need to know HIPAA. And so when we talk about HIPAA, we talk about protected health information, right? So what is PHI? That's what I'll call it from now on. PHI is any information that directly identifies the individual. So Heather McCreary, my name in relationship to my medical record would be PHI. You would know that was my record and it applied to me. Also, it could be any other information that serves as a reasonable basis to identify the individual. So if you had enough clues, you could figure out that's Heather McCreary. If it was my birth date and my gender, you might have some reasonable basis to identify that that is who I am. So protected health information is huge. It's very broad, and it covers a lot of things. So how does it apply really to the clinical research coordinator? You need to know that HIPAA authorizations have to be obtained from subjects. They have to allow you and give you the authorization to look at their protected health information if they're going to be on a trial. You have to take steps to minimize identifiable information. We'll go over this more at another time, but there are steps you can take to de-identify information, and it has to be de-identified before it is sent to the sponsor. There are 18 common PHI identifiers. Some of them are really obvious, like date of birth and things like that, and some of them are a little bit more obscure. I have these included as a PDF in this module immediately following this lecture, so I want you to look at those. And then you have to understand what incidental disclosure is. So the whole idea behind HIPAA is that we are going to treat PHI very carefully, and we're going to be very judicious about how we share PHI. It's only on a need-to-know basis. However, there's something called incidental disclosure, and so in the course of providing medical care or coordinating clinical research activities, sometimes information might be disclosed unintendedly. A good example is rounding. So physicians will make rounds on patients, and they will discuss patient information at sometimes a nurse's station. If a family member were to be waiting for the elevator and sort of eavesdropping a little bit, that would be incidental disclosure, because it's reasonable that those physicians have taken some consideration and are discussing patient care in a nurse's station that usually has some degree of privacy. If that conversation were to be overheard, that would not be a violation of the law. That would be called incidental disclosure. On the other hand, if you had two doctors on an elevator talking about patient care that included some PHI, then that would not be incidental disclosure, because they should have the common sense not to be talking about patients on an elevator, and that is not sort of private, and they have not taken steps to make sure that information is maintained. So incidental disclosure, there is some allowance in HIPAA to say that sometimes things can be overheard, if you will. So HIPAA and subject screening. So how does that affect you and your investigator's ability to find patients to put on a clinical trial? HIPAA allows investigators to perform review preparatory to research in order to find potential subjects. And so a lot of times in private practices, especially, doctors will go through and they'll have a database of their patients to determine if they have potential subjects. When acting as a covered entity, and I'll get to this in a second, the PI, the principal investigator, or you as a delegate may contact the subjects. So how do you know if you're a covered entity? And what is a covered entity? You've probably not used that term before. A covered entities are defined under HIPAA as health plans, which in other words, insurance companies, healthcare clearinghouses, which are you're probably not going to work at, or healthcare providers who electronically transmit any health information. So healthcare providers will electronically transmit health information for insurance claims. So it is very, very, very likely that you will be working as a covered entity, and you have the authorization, you have the ability under HIPAA to go ahead and do screening to find potential subjects as a covered entity. If not a covered entity, the PI can go to the IRB and receive a partial waiver. And the PI can make this case to the IRB that I need to find potential subjects and this is how I'm going to do it, and the IRB can give permission. You'll be working as a covered entity likely. Now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the Declaration of Helsinki. The Declaration, and bear with me for a minute, we're going to go through some ethical things and we're going to talk about some ethical considerations, and this will sort of tie together very shortly. We'll talk a lot more about these things when we get to ethics and clinical research. But the Declaration of Helsinki, which has been around for decades, is really the gold standard on ethical concerns and ethical principles for clinical research. And the Declaration of Helsinki has set forth some standards for ethics in clinical research. And the fundamental principle in all of this is the respect for the individual. So, and we demonstrate this through the consent process and some things that we do, but that the respect for the individual is paramount. Individuals have the right to self-determination, right? We talked about some exceptions for consent. They're very rare. And we allow people to make decisions for themselves. And the right to make informed decisions. So that's part of the consent process. We give people information so they can make a decision based on information. The investigator, and by virtue of investigator, the clinical research coordinator's duty is solely to the patient. There are sort of competing demands. So there's the sponsor, there's the IRB, there's the investigator. They all sort of have a different take on what they're going to get out of clinical research. But if you had to prioritize it, the sole duty is to the patient for you and your investigator. The welfare of the individual participant must always take precedence of the interests of science and society. And this goes back to Nazi Germany, where the state was really considered to be the patient, and the individual's welfare was put secondary to what was considered at the time to be the best interests of society. So science and society take a real serious backseat in the Declaration of Helsinki. And that ethical considerations also rule, and they take precedence over laws and regulations. So there is no defense to say, well, it's the law or it was the regulation that told me to do that. Your ethical consideration in respect for the individual and your sole duty to the patient really reign supreme over any kinds of laws and regulations. We also have the Belmont Report to talk about. Again, we'll get into more in the ethics class, but this is the ethical principle of U.S. clinical research that was put together in the 1970s. There are 3 overriding principles in the Belmont Report. It's much easier to remember. Respect for persons, and then we do this through the informed consent process that I mentioned a few minutes ago. And that is how we respect the person's ability to make decisions for themselves by providing them the information they need to make a decision. Beneficence then is the do no harm or do not harm principle. And that's sort of, most people feel like that goes without saying, that healthcare providers will do no harm, but apparently it bears some saying. And how we really sort of demonstrate this is that you maximize the benefits of participating in a clinical trial while simultaneously minimizing the possible harms. So not only do you just not harm, that you sort of give as much advantage to benefits and minimize the harms at the same time. And we'll talk about this more when we get talking about study designs. And then justice. That's the third ethical principle of the Belmont Report. And by justice, we mean fairness, which is then ethically picking subjects for trials. In this country, we have special considerations for people who are in jail, for example. People who are prisoners are awesome participants in clinical research because they never miss their appointments. You always know where they are. But we have taken some thought and some consideration in this country to say, is that fair for us to ask one group of people to bear the burden of the risks of clinical trial? So how we pick and how we select subjects for trials has to be based in ethical frameworks, and that in this case is justice. And again, we'll talk more about this. So the Declaration of Helsinki and the Belmont Report are very important in this country for how we decide to, how beyond the regulations, how we conduct clinical research. And now I'm going to hop into ICH. These three things are sort of going to come into focus here momentarily. It might seem like we're sort of jumping around. But ICH is the International Conference on Harmonization with an S. And what it really is, the International Conference on Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Registration of Pharmaceuticals for Human Use. That is much too long to say. So you'll see people, and you'll hear people referring to ICH. And if they do say it, they'll just say the International Conference on Harmonization. And so the International Conference on Harmonization, the goal is to harmonize drug development requirements between Japan, the European Union, and the United States. So in the United States, if Pfizer develops a drug for high cholesterol, for example, and they decide, the FDA approves this drug, they say it's safe, it works, Pfizer might then want to say, you know what, I think we can also sell this drug very easily in Germany and France. In Germany and France, a lot of the drug development that's been done in the U.S. would be accepted. There would be additional work that Pfizer would have to do to get that drug approved in the EU, but a lot of the groundwork that has been laid would be accepted because there has been this harmonization of the requirements between these three regions. The main focus of ICH is safety, quality, efficacy, and it also talks about multidisciplinary matters. We're going to get into a lot more depth with ICH when we take the good clinical practice class. But the whole idea then is to not reinvent the wheel, that these three regions will have requirements that are standardized and harmonized so that it is easier and faster to get drugs approved from one spot to the next spot. So good clinical practice that I just mentioned, we have a whole freestanding class about good clinical practice, is a universally accepted standard for all clinical trials activities. It's derived from all of these. Think of GCP as a big umbrella. It's derived from the FDA regulations and the guidance documents, the ICH guidelines, and the codes of ethical behavior that I just mentioned, the Declaration of Helsinki and the Belmont Report. So GCP is like this big umbrella, and under the umbrella are all these various parts. And when you bring them all together, we call that collectively good clinical practice. And again, we have a separate class to talk about this. So that's why now you can see why I went through ICH and why I went through Helsinki and Belmont to talk about those things, because they all come together in this one pot of GCP. So here's the reference. This is the chapter 4. So please make sure that you read that. I love your questions. I can't emphasize enough that I need to hear from you. If something's unclear or it's a little foggy, I love answering your questions. So take care, and I will talk to you again soon.